Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get both of us as speakers introduced, and then we'll get started. Andrew, why don't you start?
Oh, thank you so much. So yeah, my name is Andrew Bales Collins, or ABC. I think I know quite a few of you looking at the attendance list, but there's some people I also don't know. I'm the technical officer for the Ghent Workgroup, and my day job is the head of product management at Ultimate Technographics, the imposition, nesting, and ganging company. You probably know the product InpoStrip. Prior to that, I worked for InFocus for 11 years, looking after most of it spent on pit stop. And prior to that, I worked for a company called One Vision in Germany. So about 25 years experience in PDF and workflows. And of course, prior to that, I worked in the industry as a pre-press manager. So hopefully I know what I'm doing. And the idea of today is to convey some of that knowledge to you, which I hope you find interesting. David.
Cool. So unfortunately, I think I'm over 25 years of experience already as well. Some of it at InFocus as well, two different points in my career. I spent some time at a company called Gradual Software that was then acquired by ESCO. And we created Switch there, which is a name probably many of you will recognize as a product as well. And at the moment, I'm the CTO at 4Ps, a value-added software distributor in an integrator from Belgium. I've spent about 20 years at the Ghent Workgroup, at the moment as executive director, and then I'm co-chair of a number of the subcommittees there as well. So let's maybe say two words about, a little bit more than two words, about where we come from and who organizes this, this webinar in the first place. Ghent Workgroup, if you would not have heard of it, is an international organization. The members are graphic arts associations. They are software and hardware developers in graphic arts. We have a number of educational institutions. We have consultants. So a reasonable cross-section of the graphic arts industry, mostly at the production side. So not so much from the designer side, I would say. And so I'll just let you read this, but we have two parts to our mission, and that has been the case for the last 20 years. First is the development of best practices. And that can be about pre-flight, it can be about color, it can be anything that we think is relevant for the graphic art segment. And then the second one is to also promote their acceptance and have educational initiatives, if you want, to make sure that people also use what is developed. And so this is essentially why we're doing this webinar today as well, as part of our outreach and education towards the graphic arts industry.
I think important to say as well, we come from a neutral perspective on this. So I think we're uniquely qualified to talk about it to a certain extent.
Very important, and I think it's worthwhile saying very much at the start of this that we're also not intending to get mixed up in any of the business relationship issues that might be around this topic. Of course, we're going to mention both Adobe and Pantone because that's what this whole thing is about, but the interaction between those two companies should remain where it is between those two companies as far as we're concerned. Cross-section of our members. I'm not going to mention them all, but you can see that it's a pretty wide range of of logos here, most of which, or many of which you will probably recognize. And what is very good to see is that over the last couple of years, the amount of educational members, so universities and high schools and stuff like that, has increased quite a bit, which is important from a communication point of view, also to the new people that join this industry.
I think also it's interesting to point at the bottom, industry members, there's a few actual printing companies whose business is to actually print we have as members. So we are very open to new members, as you will see later. So if any of you would like to understand more about how to become a member and how to get involved, then we will certainly not dissuade you from doing that.
Absolutely. This is a volunteer organization largely. So if someone wants to do work, it is very easy to get a job here. So I think in general, as I said, also about the mission, the goal is to identify issues in the industry. We've actually done some work that has resulted in the creation of ISO standards, for example, which is ideal. We have a lot of knowledge from the industry, from practical, down-to-earth work. And if that can lead to the development of an international standard, then that is absolutely great. And so if you go to the Ghent Workgroup website, you'll see a lot of the practical results of what we've developed.
This is a really good overview of the kind of stuff we do, you know, dealing with real world issues, and also with an eye on the future as well, and things that are coming and how they could be implemented. So everything we do as well, I think it should be said, is free and can be downloaded. We are a non-profit organization, and the goal is education and best practices. So if you've not gone to the website, I think you'll find a lot of very interesting information there for yourselves.
I certainly hope so. And like we said before, go to the website, also have a look at YouTube and the webinars that are already there, because lots of them contain very practical information and are just great resources, really.
Yeah. The membership, you can actually join the webinars, the members' webinars remotely. You don't have to. In fact, a lot of people do that. We have 3 meetings a year, typically one in the US, one in Europe, and one normally in Belgium. And not only do you learn a lot, but also networking opportunities. You've seen the vendors and the companies involved. It's a huge amount of information within the group. And I have to say, it's been very, very useful for me. I've been involved, you know, for about 10 years now, and quite incredible the amount of knowledge involved in the Ghent Workgroup in all aspects of the industry. So maybe something to consider, or even at least join, and you can come along as an observer, which I think we talk about later, and just get an understanding of what we do.
Yep, and if you're interested, don't be shy. As you can see here, there are some opportunities. The easiest perhaps is to join a subcommittee if there is a topic that you're particularly interested in, whether it's pre-flight or color or packaging or any of the things that we're working on. You can join a subcommittee even without being otherwise a member of the Ghent Workgroup. And a lot of the times information is exchanged through email and stuff like that. And that makes it easy to at least remain up to date with what's happening there.
A couple of the latest things that we've kind of spread our wings over. One is VDP, so variable data. And then we also have a subcommittee which are working on what we're struggling to find a name for it. We started with non-professional applications, but that's probably not strictly true. So we're talking about things like Canva and some of the new ways of generating PDF outside of the traditional desktop applications. So if that's of interest to anybody, then you might be interested in joining, or at least getting involved.
If you're more adventurous and you want to join us in real life, you can see some of the upcoming meetings there. Those are the ones that are already planned, where we already have a location where it's going to happen. Again, just get in contact, and if you would be interested, and we can get you all the practical details. And I think from an introduction point of view, that is more or less it. You have the link to the website here, some social media links. So let's get started with some real content, perhaps. Our goal for this, and maybe just to set the scene, our goal for this was to look at this from a very practical point of view. Like I said, we don't want to get tangled up in the business relationship and who did what to whom. I think there are lots of sources on the internet where you can read all kinds of very interesting stories about what is happening. But that's not our goal here. Our goal with this webinar is to explain some of the background, the technical background of what spot colors are and how they work and what is important. And I think that is important because I've seen some of these stories contain lots of things that are not correct or that overlook certain details that are important. So our goal was to share that, and then also look at so what can you do from a technical point of view going forward? What are the options that you have? And then we also had the opportunity to talk to someone from Pantone about this, and we can share at least what they have at the moment as their official statement, but that will be at the end of this. So, shall we get started, Andrew?
I think we shall, yeah. I mean, as you said, the goal really is just to combat some of the misinformation. So what we have is some solid practical advice, and yeah, hopefully you'll learn a few things as well, which is always good.
Well, hopefully, yes. And if there are questions or you don't agree with stuff, like we said, just share it in chat or in the Q&A section, and we'll keep an eye on that as well.
Yeah.
I'll let you be the designer, Andrew.
Yes. So let's just walk back to the beginning of the process. So there's a relationship between the customer and the creative. Normally, an exchange of ideas, an exchange of some kind of intent of what is going to happen and what the job is going to look like, and especially what the color is going to look like. And I think that's a key part of what we're going to be talking about today. It's about communication. And very often we rely on the file or the ink mix to do the communication, or we've relied on that in the last sort of decade. What may be prudent moving forward is there's also some kind of communication, some verbal communication to establish just what is needed to make the process work. But you can see here, someone's got an idea of a flower, someone then comes up and suggests a color, and from that color, that's turned into a swatch, and then that swatch eventually finds itself onto a substrate. So that's really what we're illustrating here, that kind of creative relationship in this slide.
Yeah, and I think the important part already starting there is that you can really have two types of swatches, something that what I call here a convenience swatch, that is just a name for a process color or a color that you want to reuse in a design. And then you have a spot swatch, and of course the spot swatches are what interests us here, because that goes into the area of color books and patch collections and so on.
Okay, so here we have some swatches, and when you make a swatch, or sorry, let me make it step back a bit. When you make a spot color, there are really three parts of it. So there is the name of the swatch or the name of the color. There is the color space, which you mix to build a visual representation of that color. And you'll see here we have 3 examples that from a, one in CMYK, one in RGB, one in LAB, and that's called the alternate color or the alternative color. And then you actually have the breakdown, so the mix of the channels to give you the visual representation that you require. And as we move forward, you'll see that these things have different importance depending upon the printing process that you're going to use and the devices that are going to be involved in the process.
I think that's one of the important things that I've noticed in some of the discussion on the web about this whole topic is that you have people who say, oh, it's only the name that is important and that should be correct and the rest is just for visualization. And unfortunately, depending on how the file is going to be printed, processed, that is not correct. I think it's important to understand in which situations the name is important, in which situations the alternate color is important, and how that works. So that's one of the things that we definitely want to go into a little bit more detail. So the next bit, if we're talking about the about spot color, the next bit is production. And I think, as always, there is a bit of a disconnect sometimes when you look at the knowledge that you also find in these articles online somehow between the design side or the creative side and the production side.
Yeah, the best one I saw, I think, was when they said it's all the responsibility of the printer. It was one of the reasons for doing this presentation.
that is said from both sides, right? I always find it very interesting. Creatives say that, oh, but it should be the printer. We'll blame the printer, and the printers say, oh, we'll blame the creatives. In the end, that's not a very helpful attitude.
An estimation and production say it's all in the file. It's all in the PDF. Don't worry about it.
So when we're talking about spot, the question is, as I said before, which of these things is important? Is it the name? Is it the alternate color? What is it that is going to determine how the file is actually going to print? And it turns out that it depends on how these files are printed. Yeah. If you want to print something using special inks, whether it's an ink or a toner, it doesn't matter. But if you're going to print these colors as special inks, then typically it is the name that is important, because that is going to determine which objects are going to be printed with that special ink. If you're going to print it as CMYK, then the situation, unfortunately, is a little bit more complex than that. And we need to look at that in some detail to understand what is going on. So let's start with a situation where we are going to use a special ink for that. So I'm basically going to print using CMYK and then one or more special inks. In that case, as we said, the name is super important. And the first pitfall, and this is part of most pre-flight profiles and pre-flight technologies because it is so important. The first pitfall is that the name has to be absolutely correct. And you see some examples there of things that are not the same or not considered to be the same. And I think that no one has a problem understanding that a spot color called Very Nice Blue and one called Pantone Reflex Blue C, that those are not the same. Yeah? People seem to have a lot more trouble understanding that the C and the U variant are different, but they are considered to be different. And then actually even lowercase and uppercase technically makes a difference because they refer to different spot colors. Yeah? And that the example that you see on the left is an example of a file that contains CMYK and then Pantone Reflex Blue. Probably the intention was to have 5 colors in that file, but if you don't do anything, then 6 plates will be generated in this particular case.
Yeah, I mean, that's been around since for a very long time, and of course Preflight can very easily handle that and also resolve it. But and also you should be aware, and you probably are aware, that these names will also be reflected in lookup tables on digital devices. You know, we have digital devices now with a wide gamut ink sets. If you want a close representation or the best representation of a Pantone color, it will work on the name, and it will use that name, and or have a lookup table which gives the best rendition on the substrate using that particular print engine.
Yeah, and so then we enter into the area where we don't print it using a special ink, but we render it as we're actually going to print this as CMYK, and that means that the spot color has to be converted to CMYK, and then the question is how, and depending on the mechanism that is used, like Andrew said, the name can be very important. If you have a lookup table, then you'd better define the Pantone colors or whatever system you use, but the spot color name in your file exactly the same as the lookup table that you have in the device or in the software that you're using. Software could allow some kind of fuzzy match if it wanted to, but technically in PDF, even 2 spot colors with a different case are different spot colors, and they should end up on different plates.
So CXF is something that's gaining in popularity. It's something we're aware of at the Ghent Workgroup. Stands for Color Exchange Format. It's also something that can be used within PDF. There's various software applications that can deal with it. And the best way to think of it really is it as a digital swatch book. So it's like having a digital way of transmitting information from one person to another, increasingly popular with brands. The way it works, and you'll see from the next slide, is that you print a test swatch on, typically if you wish to do it properly, you do it on the correct substrate on the device that you're going to be printing it on. And then with the spectrophotometer, you measure these patches, typically 11, one on white, and then the second on black. And then from that, you build a CXF file. And that file can be used for a variety of things like ink mixing and quality control, but it can also be put in the PDF. So you see down here in the bottom diagram, this is from the International Color Consortium, the ICC website. The little blue things, little 3 blue things in the bottom right hand corner, these are the CXF files. So it's actually part of the output intent of a PDFX file. And this is a very, very accurate way of describing color, and of course checking color as well. So this is something that is definitely a consideration for actually very good color matching.
It's easy to understand that this is way more complicated than taking a color book, looking at a swatch or a patch of color there and seeing what the LAB colors are for that particular color. So it's going to be much more difficult to create a CXF blob for a particular color, but it also contains much more information. And especially if you want to start mixing different spot colors and you want to know what the behavior is going to look like, you have a chance of doing that properly with CXF data. If you only have the LAB values of the spot colors, then that simply doesn't give you enough information to do proper ink matching predictions on a document. Yeah, you can embed these in a PDF file. Like Andrew answered in chat just now, there are various applications that know how to do that. And there is now a standard way of embedding the data in a PDF file as well, which is something that was missing for a while. CXF itself is an ISO standard, so you can read about that more on the ISO website. You have the ISO number for the standard on screen, but it's easy to find if you just look for CXF on the ISO website as well.
If you do a Google search for it, there's an awful lot of information. Just make sure that it's the CXF regarding color, not the CXF from Apache web servers, which some people apparently got very confused with early on. So yeah, this is a nice problem, which some of you may or may not have come across. David, do you want to take this one?
Well, yeah, there is a high chance of getting things wrong.
Certainly a breeding ground for misinformation, let's put it that way.
I think it goes back to what we said before. Spot color is identified by its name, but also it has an alternate color. And if you have to convert it into CMYK, then and you don't have a lookup table, for example, or you don't have CXF information, then the only thing you can do is use the alternate color that is in the PDF file. And so for starters, then it's going to depend on what alternate color space is used. As Andrew said before, you have the ability to use different color spaces. So the alternate color could be CMYK already. In that case, it's easy, and you can just preserve what is already in the PDF document. But if the alternate color is RGB or LAB, then that needs to be converted into CMYK. Yeah. And I think a couple of years, I don't know how many years ago, but a couple of years ago, there was also lots of discussion about the color information in many applications, because they switched from, if I remember correctly, having CMYK as alternate color to LAB as alternate color. And that can lead to a different CMYK color mix in the end if you're not very careful.
Absolutely. Yeah, that caused a huge problem, because people, of course, were used to printing CMYK out of an application, and when it changed to LAB, they were unaware that change had happened, and the resulting CMYK values they got depended completely on their color management settings. So you would put the same job on press that you printed, last month, and you would get a completely different set of results. And it was only when people looked back that they found out they had a different set of CMYK values, because the alternate was LAB, which is actually the way it's designed. It would, if you think about it, it does not make any sense to think that using the same set of CMYK values in every printing process on any available substrate, it's all going to look the same. LAB at least gives you a steer to at least compensate for different substrates and different profiles.
And I'll read out an interesting question, which actually leads into some of the discussion we wanted to have afterwards as well. The question that came in was, if printing conditions change over time, do you need to update CXF data files for spot color conversions? And if so, how often? And I, unfortunately, I think that if you want, it depends on the quality that you want in the end and how accurate things should be. But if printing conditions change, then yes, you should update the information you have for spot colors. And that's not only true for CXF data, it can actually also be true for the alternate color that you have in spot color definitions as well. One of the things that I think we'll refer to later is that if you look at the color books that you have in the Adobe applications, but also in other applications, it's not just important to have those there, it's important to have them there in an as recent version as possible, because as things change, you want the color books to reflect that change. Yeah. So if your printing conditions change, if the way you print things change, or if the media changes that you print on and so on, then yes, you'll have to, ideally, you'll have to recreate the CXF information or the alternate color space information that you're using for spot colors.
Yep.
If you talk about spot color, in many cases, people start thinking about Pantone and other color library systems. But in fact, I think it's also important to realize that spot color in PDF, specifically in production workflows, is often used for other things as well. And just to go into that a little bit so that you understand where the other places are you could find spot color and what the reason is, and perhaps the things you should look out for in those cases. Yeah. And the first thing is that if you read the PDF specification, which is like the I should say standard now because it's an ISO standard. If you read the document about the ISO standard for PDF, it contains a number of reserved names, what they call, I believe, special colors in the standard text. And that's not too difficult of a concept, but it's still interesting to know. So a spot color, if you define a spot color and you give it the name cyan, magenta, yellow, or black, then what the PDF specification says is that those colors should behave as the corresponding process color. Yeah. So they're not really treated as special inks, they're treated as if you just refer to a process color. The more interesting one is a special color called all, which most of you probably know as registration color. And the definition there says, if you put something in a PDF and it uses a spot color and the name is all, then it should be painted on all separations in that document. Yeah? No matter how many, but these elements that use that particular spot color are going to show up on every separation that you generate. And in fact, this is one of the things that often goes wrong. You're not supposed to use this color for example, black text on a page, because typically you want black text only to appear on the black plate and you don't want it to appear on all 4 CMYK plates. Very common problem that is easily detected by pre-flight. And then there is a last one that is used very infrequently, and that is a spot color with the name none. And the definition there is that any element that uses a spot color called none should not have an effect on the printed output. So it behaves as if it's invisible, if you want. Like I said, not something that you see a lot, but it is one of the 6 special colors that you can find in a PDF document.
Yeah, now we have the wild, wild west. So if there's anybody here from wide format and packaging, you'll know that there are other separations that are needed, maybe that are not even being printed, that are used in other processes. And there are absolutely no standards to what they should be called. And if you're working internationally, then localization also gets involved. And yeah, there can be lots and lots of separations. And as it says at the bottom, there is a standard. And this is one of the ones that the Ghent Workgroup is very proud of, because it started with us and it's now an ISO standard, which is the processing steps, ISO 15993-1. But and that uses that uses optional content groups, which you may know as layers in a PDF, for separating the printed content with the actual non-printing content. So things like embossing, cut contours, white, but all sorts of other things like that. So yeah, another very, very commonly found use of spot colors that we really would be remiss if we didn't mention.
And typically something that I would think if you're in that market segment and you're using InDesign or Illustrator or whatever it is to create files, that you would also have swatches for to make sure that as you're designing things, hopefully you have one name for a particular concept and you want to reuse that in well, in all the files that you generate.
Yeah, and I think most shops have standards because they need to go to a, you know, a cutting table or a Scodex or something else. So there are sort of semi standards in there within a shop, but there's nothing industry wide, of course.
If you are in that segment and you have not heard about processing steps, it is something that was standardized, as Andrew said, as an ISO standard now. It always takes some time before that also becomes present in all of the software and the hardware out there. And it's, as always, such changes need a bit of time and it's a slow adoption usually, but it is something that you should see more and more in specialized software, is the ability to use processing steps instead of just relying on a single spot color name. And the idea was that you could standardize it with processing steps and you could continue to use whatever spot color name that you want to use, even though the suggestion is to use something that perhaps is also standardized. But well, people in Germany or Belgium or anywhere basically like to use their own language once in a while. So translations are not uncommon there.
Yeah, and slightly off topic, but there is a very good white paper on that in on the Ghent Workgroup website, which explains an awful lot about the way it works.
About the processing steps, you mean, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we have some webinars about that specifically with some background information there as well. So you can always refer back to those as well.
Yes, and the Pantone is not the only color model out there, of course. There are, and over the years, there have been several different ones, especially depending on where you're working. There are certainly different color models that you could investigate that will also help you communicate color values and color representations between, you know, the design and the customer and the printing process. So yeah, there's a few there that maybe you know, and maybe a few you don't. One interesting one is the SMS system, the spot matching system. That's a relatively new one, which is coming out of Norway. Got quite an interesting website. Focal Tone, which is one that is purely process based, which is less. It was very big actually, and it's available in some Adobe applications, but you may struggle to find some swatch books. And I had a question actually: is it correct to call HKS as color model? Well, this is the way these are described, so I think it's a fair of us to call them those. And one question actually: only Pantone will leave Adobe, not the others. Yeah, I mean Pantone and Adobe, that's the one that's being publicized. The others, some of them are already available in InDesign. Certainly HKS and sort of Toyo, they're already in there. You just have to look at the available swatches there. True Match as well, they're already in the application.
And let's not just say that Pantone will leave Adobe. We'll come back to that because that's under discussion as far as we've understood, at least still. But yeah, it's the discussion we're having is definitely based around Pantone and Adobe, not around these other color books or color systems that you might encounter. And then some additional questions, long questions.
That is a long one.
Yeah, so I'm going to pick up the one about the open source one. I'm not sure how much you looked at this open color standard, Andrew, and whether that's really is that an open source initiative or something else? Because I personally had not heard about that one.
No, it's a new one, and it's very broad in its remit. It's not just for print; it's also beyond print. So I think if you're interested in any of these, then you would need a little bit of further investigation to see if it meets your requirements. But they certainly are all what we would call alternative color models with color definitions, and some even with swatch books that you can purchase.
No worry about the long question, by the way. It's just a challenge to multitask, given that I'm a man. I think the open source question is an interesting one, and one that in a way I'd like to come back to a little bit later in the discussion. What I'll add to that now is that perhaps there is an interest in doing that. The question is how much effort would be involved in doing that, and would there be a big enough community around that to make it succeed? Keeping in mind that it's not just about the color information and the system around that. It's also about the knowledge on making the special inks afterwards and stuff like that. So it's not just a list of colors, I think.
You know, the swatch book I guess is really important because it's a physical thing that all parties can say, you know, this is what it's supposed to look like. CXF plays into that as well. It's kind of a digital swatch book, but as you've seen already previously in this presentation, it's not enough just to give a set of values and expect to get the expected result unless there's additional communication as well.
Yeah, so let's talk very briefly about, and I think most of you will realize this and know this, but I thought it important to include it anyway, what the advantages are of having those patch collection, color books, whatever you want to name it, in software, and then look at, so what options do you have going forward? I think the option should be, or the advantage of having these things should be relatively easy to understand. You have a color book that shows what these colors look like in real life, and they are linked to digital collections of the name that you need and the alternate color space that you need to represent it accurately, or as accurately as possible, on screen while you're designing, and then making sure that you have the correct ink on output. Yeah. And as we said before, depending on the context you're working in, either the name or the alternate color is important, or both. And I think in many cases, both are important. Even if you're going to print with special inks, the importance of having a good alternate in there is that that's what you're going to see on screen. Anywhere where you don't have the special ink, which means on your monitor as well, that is what you're going to see. And so having something that comes relatively close to what you're finally going to print, I imagine is not unimportant for most people. And coming back to a point that we made a while ago, and actually there is a comment in here from Paul as well, that goes in the same direction. The result that you're going to have is, of course, only to be going as it's only as good as the swatches that you have in the application. It's cool to have color books in an application, but if these are not up to date, or if your color books are not up to date because you've left them in the sun for the last 5 years, then you're not going to have a good match between the two. Yeah. And as we said in the beginning, or earlier in this webinar, the fact that some of these color books in the Adobe software had not been updated as much as they could have been is important in that context, because it means you have at least the potential of having outdated information in there. So from a technical point of view, and we're not talking about we're not talking business here, and what is acceptable from a business point of view. And you can certainly talk about that and ask questions about that. But from a technical point of view, what are your options if color books, whether it's Pantone or something else? Of course, we're talking about Pantone right now because that's what started this. But if some of these things are no longer available, what are the options that you have? And I'll start with one.
Yeah, and I think it's important here because this is the key bit, isn't it? This is about how do we communicate.
Yeah, and my preferred option is always to do nothing if you can get away with it. So you have the ability, of course, in the Adobe applications and in other applications to define your own collections of swatches. There is nothing from stopping you to do that going forward. If I have a company I work for, I can obviously make a swatch collection for that company's brand and use those in projects, and that is absolutely going to work. Yeah, as long as you define the patches correctly, and as stated there as well. Also, if you can communicate with the person who's going to produce things in the end, that is never going to hurt either. Yeah. But there was a time before. It goes back a long way, but there was a time before these Pantone books were included in applications. And so people did print things at that time as well. You're not stopped from defining your own colors and exchanging them with other people as well.
And when we got a question here: manually create colors needed for projects. No, what we actually mean here is you can make a swatch.
Mm-hmm.
You can make a swatch. You can give it a name. You can give it a color. And as long as the person at the other end who's receiving that file knows what you mean with that swatch, then of course you're communicating. It could be in the name, or it could be in the alternate color space as we described before. CXF could be part of it, or it could not be part of it. But basically the difference is you're manually creating the color that you want to be realized when the job is finished.
To be very concrete, if you think back to the example that Andrew had with the flower and the yellow that you want to represent it in a digital document, digital design, then you can of course look at a Pantone color book. If we take Pantone as an example, you can look at a Pantone color book, figure out which color you want to use from the printed version of that book. And then once you have determined which color you want to use, create a swatch for that color. And as long as you use the correct name and you use the LAB values that will be in your up-to-date color book, that is going to work just as well as what you would do today, which is search for it in the color book and use that. Yeah? The difference is convenience. And actually, there might be two differences. The first difference is convenience, rather than just looking for that particular name in my built-in Pantone color book in InDesign, for example. I will now have to create my own swatch. I have to give it a name and so on. Yeah. So that is one difference. The second difference is that if you have an up-to-date color book, it might contain newer LAB values than whatever you already have in InDesign or Illustrator today as well. So it might be slightly less convenient to create that color. At the same time, it might be more up to date with the color book that the latest version of the color book that you have as well. Yeah. But it's certainly a possibility.
Yeah, the key thing you have to think about here is, how is that color going to be communicated? Is it a name? Is it the values? Is it some other way? But how is sort of both ends of the, not the argument, but the chain, going to know what the other end's talking about?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and if you look at it from a printer point of view, then what they get is a PDF file. In that PDF file, the only thing they have is a name and is an alternate color space. So as long as these are the same as what you previously would have selected from this built-in color book, for the print on the printer side, there is no difference. You get a PDF file that is absolutely usable.
So this is the second approach, which is similar in a way. But you create color patches or swatches within a design layout application, and then you print or proof those patches. So you have an agreed color management target, and then both ends of the chain know what those colors are meant to look like, and those colors can then be achieved on press. So you could have a color called David's Brown, and if both of you have a proofed or a printed target that both of you know what David's Brown looks like, then that's also an approach.
If it's my color, I think it would be purple, but
or penguin black and white, I think probably, but
something like that. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, this is a little bit more complicated, but it's I think this is also for the print service providers amongst you. It also represents an opportunity to get closer to your customer in a way, in that you can give them, if you like, this service. And again, the communication then is very, very solid. So, you know what the color is going to be. They know what the color is going to be. And then you have something physical that says, this is what it looks like. That's going to work. That's the way it can also work. And I see we've got a big debate going on in the chat about Pantone Live. I think Pantone Live, I haven't had it confirmed, but I think that is really not used much. And Pantone Connect we'll talk a little bit about later.
Yeah. So of course there is another option, and actually we look at this from one side, but you could look at it from two sides, I think. If you're annoyed with Pantone, and again, we're not taking any stand or sides, we're not being sponsored, so we can say whatever we want essentially. If you're annoyed by Pantone enough, then you could look at using a different color model and use that. Preferably one that still has color books in the application you want to use. Yeah. Of course, the other option that you always have is to not use applications from Adobe and use something else. Whether that is cost efficient for you or a smart business decision is something else, and that you have to decide based on what you're doing, I think. But those two routes, of course, exist as well.
And let's be honest, these color, certainly HKS in the DACH region is widely in use, yeah. And also available in desktop applications. So there are other options there.
And at least for the moment, it looks like the disappearance of, or the possible disappearance of some of these Pantone books in software is largely restricted to the Adobe applications. Yes. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. Okay, so there is the new Pantone product, which is Pantone Connect, which is free or can be paid for. Obviously, you get more for when you pay. There is an Adobe extension for this as well, so it effectively enables you to have the swatches available in Adobe applications, but it does cost. Now, also, one thing that's quite interesting is this 15,000 colors apparently in this Pantone Connect. So many of them are not actually for printing. So there could be another argument here about we're opening up another Pandora's box, but let's save that for a future future webinar. It does exist. The colors are there. David and I have had a look at it, and it does have a lot of additional functionality which is not available in the Adobe or desktop applications in general. So, you know, it's there as a an alternative. I know they have team seats as well, similar to the way you have team seats for other applications. You can trial it, you can look at it and decide if it's worth the money, basically. You know, but it is a solution. It is there, and it would be remiss of us not to talk about it. So that is the official Pantone solution.
Yeah, and I want to say something about that that might not be very popular with everyone as well, but I understand the comments that I see in the chat as well about the quality of Pantone Connect and what functionalities it has and whether it works well and doesn't work well. I'm not a designer. I don't use the Adobe applications for a living, nor do I use Pantone Connect for a living. So I can't judge on how good it is or how bad it is at what it is supposed to do. However, what I do think we have to be careful about is that up to this point, and I wouldn't be against it, but up to this point, I have not found many designers who do things for free or like to do things for free. Actually, what I read on the internet is that there are many designers who think that they do too many things for free. I've also not found many printers that print for free. So there needs to be a little bit of caution that if you expect someone to add value with something, then it's not unreasonable to expect them to be paid for that. And I think there is some tendency in all of our heads to underestimate the intellectual property that is embedded in certain things and the cost that is embedded, the effort that is embedded in certain things. And as someone who has been active in the software development industry for a long time, I always find it very strange that we are easily convinced to buy €1,000 or dollar iPhone, but paying 99 cents for an app for it that we use daily is apparently very difficult. And that translates to what we want to pay for fonts. It translates what we want to pay for software in general. It translates to a lot of things. Yeah. The fact that Pantone creates an application that they want to be paid for by itself, I don't find a horrible thing. I find that quite normal, actually. The question, and that is a question that everyone needs to answer for themselves, the question is, does it work well enough? And does it add enough value to justify the costs that it has? Yeah. Again, we're not on Pantone's side. We're not on Adobe's side. I generally am not on anyone's side. I would urge people to look at what is going on, maybe a little bit more dispassionately, and look at what do I need from a technical point of view and what makes sense. And I think if Pantone Connect makes sense, even though it costs some money, and you think that it brings you more value than you have to pay for it, it's not an unreasonable solution in that case.
No. And I mean, I think if you look at some of the questions and comments we're getting coming in, somebody said that Adobe converts Pantone colors differently. Well, actually, it probably doesn't. But what you may be doing is you may be working with LAB alternate colors, and then you will get different colors depending on how your color management is set up. So it's probably not a correct statement, but you need to understand the process, which is one of the things we try to outline here of the pitfalls, you know, of converting and of making swatches. And there's a lot of people pushing the, you know, the CXF Toolbox product on CGS. I don't know if they work for CGS or not, but you need to think about that as well. CXF is a good way to communicate color, but somebody has to be responsible for making that CXF file. And as David said before, if the printing conditions change, it has to be kept up to date. So there are alternatives, definitely. And I think we're being fair and offering you some that can be used, but you just have to think about whose responsibility it is to keep them up to date and maintain them.
Yeah, I think the bottom line of this whole presentation in a way, and that was also the conclusion. I found it interesting to go through this process of preparing this as well for that reason, is that you get to realize that the technical issues are not that exciting. You have color definitions, you have to define them properly in order to get them printed correctly. And for spot color, the issues are probably smaller than for CMYK, to be honest. You just need to have the name correct of the spot color, and you need to have the alternate color correct. And once you realize that that is the extent of the technical problem that you have, then you need to see what options, what is the best option for you in the business that you're doing in order to do that. And maybe the best option is to simply create things from scratch if you don't want to pay for additional software. Yeah, and that's not an issue from a point of view of the production guy who needs to print this. Whether you select these colors from a color book that is built into the software, or you select it from a color book that you have created in the software, or you've just created a swatch by hand for this particular project, that doesn't matter. As long as it's properly defined, it's going to work.
Yeah. You think somebody's standing by a Heidelberg 102 with a printing plate in their hands, and they want to know what color to pour into the ink duct. How are you going to communicate that information? It's probably by the name of the Pantone or the spot color in the file. It's Pantone blah blah blah. If it's anything else, then you need a reference. You've got a swatch book there. You know the color it's meant to be. If it's David's brown, then there's a little bit more communication needed to understand what David's brown looks like.
Correct. As I said,
I'm trying to make it kind of easy, but we got a lot of professional people on this call. You've been dealing with this for years. Most of you probably understand how it works. Hopefully we're making some sense. You feel free to comment if we're not.
There's a good question, and I don't know what the answer is. I think I know what the answer is, but I'm not sure, and so I'll say it under I want to be careful. But so the question is, if you're a print shop and you get an InDesign file from a customer that has been using Pantone Connect and using swatches from Pantone Connect, as a printer, are we be able to export a PDF X4 from the InDesign document without having Pantone Connect? Yeah, and I think the answer is yes. I want to give a different answer. So to come back to the first answer, I think the answer is yes. I think that's just part of the InDesign file definition, but that it would be good if that would be verified by someone who's actually done that. Yeah. Of course, especially as member of the Ghent Workgroup, my answer to you needs to be a little bit different. My answer would be, if you're a printer and you get a file from a designer who creates something with Pantone Connect, I actually would hope that you would get a PDF X4 file in the first place, yeah, because that's the proper way of exchanging the information from design to production. And I can tell you for certain that if you get a PDF X4 file exported from InDesign or Illustrator, that yes, that is going to have proper spot color definitions in it, regardless of where the spot color comes from in the first place. Yeah. So in that case, there is no issue at all.
One thing actually I do want to mention here is that there are apparently 15,000 colors in this Adobe Connect, Pantone Connect. We mentioned before lookup tables within DFEs and things like that. Now, to my knowledge, most DFEs have got probably the Pantone coated lookup tables and the Pantone uncoated lookup tables. I don't think there's an awful lot more lookup tables in the DFEs. So it's very possible that there won't be a match with some of these more exotic colors that may be floating around. So it's just something to be aware of.
In which case, remember what we said about conversion.
Yeah.
If you have a DFE that uses lookup tables and the color is not found, it's going to revert to the alternate color definition
definitely
in the file. Yeah. Okay, let's get to the point where we talked to someone from Pantone who was kind enough to reach out to us and talk to us before this this webinar. We've talked about a whole bunch of things with them and the concerns that are going on in the industry and so on. I've seen some additional articles appear on the internet just today, where essentially the same kind of statement came out as well. So essentially, the official statement as far as Pantone is concerned is that this situation around the Pantone books and Adobe applications is still under discussion. Yeah, so at least they indicate that there has not been a final decision on how to move forward. They did indicate to us and allow to share with you as well is that an announcement with a way forward that is good for the industry is expected at some future time. I understand this is very vague and it sounds very much like talking to a politician. Yeah. But you have to be fair to them as well. I think what it boils down to is that these companies obviously have some kind of relationship. And as some of the comments I've seen pass by indicated, yes, this probably has to do with money. I mean, we have to be honest about that. That is probably what it is, bottom line. But I think at least there is an understanding that it would be good to, if there is a transition of some kind, to do the transition in such a way that it is not going to shock the workflows that are in place at the moment.
Yeah, I think you have to also look at the date. It's the 30th of March today, and the original statement from last year, I even believe it was that it would happen in March. It's obviously not going to happen in March. So yeah, things have changed, it would seem.
Yeah, I think things have changed. I think the good thing about some of this coming up in the community and discussion about this in the community, on the internet, in the press, is that, well, sometimes you need to wake up big companies in order for them to realize that perhaps they didn't consider all the different angles in this discussion, and to see whether they can find a way to resolve it peacefully. We don't have any information about what's going to happen beyond what the statement here says, but at least from the Pantone side, there seems to be an indication that it is still being discussed. And I think the Adobe statement that was on their website that triggered all of this actually has already been modified meanwhile, at least once as well. Yeah. So there is perhaps a growing understanding between the different parties. And I think it would be wise to, yeah, perhaps to also only try to solve the problems when they really occur. And that means waiting a little bit to see how this is all going to end up, and only then decide what your strategy is in dealing with this.
Yeah. But I think in the meantime, perhaps educate yourself and maybe be a little bit forward thinking and decide if the worst does happen, how you're going to handle it. And hopefully we've given you some ideas and some information that was useful to you today.
Yeah, I would also urge, and this is again, it's a bit of a personal frustration of having been in the software industry for way too long. I would also urge people to not just say that that the Pantone stuff is not useful or it's really bad, but to convey. I hesitate to use the word constructive because that sounds like we're talking to kids, but to state why something doesn't work for you to Pantone as well. If you think that Pantone Connect, which I think is what Pantone sees as their preferred solution moving forward, if you think that Pantone Connect doesn't work for you, why not see if you can reach out to Pantone and tell them why it does not work. It's very easy to leave a like I said, personal frustration. It's very easy to leave a one-star review, but while it may be fun to do so, and while you might think it's justified, it's probably not going to change the quality of the software. Yeah. If you give constructive feedback to software companies about what works, what would work in your process, or what doesn't work in your process at the moment, you have a much higher chance that something will actually be done about it. So if you want to approach this from a constructive, positive side, I would urge you to somehow provide that feedback to Pantone and or Adobe if you have not done that yet.
Yeah, and I think also in the discussions we've had, and David, you can, it's a personal feeling, but Adobe, Pantone are very aware that they have a customer base beyond just the design community. They are aware that there are print service providers who also are a key part in, the use of their products. And maybe their functionality has been aimed at the moment more on the design side. So if something isn't working for you, or if you have suggestions on things that you would like to see or improvements, then yeah, let them know. And I'm pretty confident that will be well received. They would like to know how they can get better based on the discussions we had with them.
Yeah, I very much second that. Absolutely.